There's a printing press on the ground floor of a building on Mulholland Street in Nauvoo, Illinois, and on the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1844, the city marshal walks in with an order to destroy it. So he does. He and his men haul the press into the street, break it apart, scatter the type across the road, and burn every copy of the one and only issue it ever printed. And the order in the marshal's hand is signed by the mayor of Nauvoo, who is Joseph Smith. Now, if you were with me for part 3, you know exactly where we opened that night. A mob in Missouri in 1833 throwing his printing press into a street in Independence, while a 15-year-old girl ran into a cornfield with the pages in her arms. 11 years sit between those two presses. Tonight is the story of what happened in between, and it is the hardest chapter in this whole series. This is part 4 of 5, and if you're just arriving, the ground is short. A farm boy in New York said God spoke to him in a grove of trees, produced a book he said came off buried golden plates, built a city in Ohio and lost it, then got driven out of Missouri under an extermination order signed by a governor. That winter, his people crossed the frozen Mississippi with nothing. That's where we pick up. The terms here haven't changed. I go where the documents go. I give the other side its strongest case, and I don't raise my voice doing it. Tonight it costs something, because the enemy here isn't a critic and it isn't a mob. It's the temptation to skip, the instinct in a faithful telling to walk you quickly past the parts that hurt. I'm not doing that, and I'll tell you at the end what it has cost this church. One thing before Illinois, and I'll keep it short. This channel hasn't been around long, and it exists so that people get the real version of this story rather than the tidy one, which on a night like tonight matters more than usual. A like or a subscribe is genuinely what keeps something this small alive. And tell me in the comments what part of the world you're in. I'm always surprised by the answers. Here's the shape of it. A swamp turns into one of the biggest cities in Illinois inside 5 years. The state hands that city a charter with an army and a court sitting inside it. The doctrine arrives faster in those 5 years than it did in the whole decade before, including the one that still gets argued about at Thanksgiving. And then the entire thing comes apart over a newspaper that printed exactly one issue. So start where they started, in the mud. In the spring of 1839, the refugees who'd crossed out of Missouri were scattered along the Illinois side of the river, sleeping in tents and wagons and in the homes of the people of Quincy. And the land Joseph Smith bought for them, mostly from a speculator named Isaac Galland, was a bend in the Mississippi at a nearly empty settlement called Commerce. It was low, flat, and wet. Half of it was swamp, and the swamp had mosquitoes, and the mosquitoes had malaria, though nobody in 1839 knew the connection. They called it the ague. That first summer, the whole settlement went down with it. Joseph gave up his own house to the sick and lived in a tent in the yard. On the 22nd of July, 1839, he walked through the camp and among the tents, administering to people, and that day is remembered among the saints as the day of God's power. Believers call it a day of miracles. A doctor would tell you malaria runs in cycles, and people get better between fevers. Both of those things can be reported honestly, and I'm going to keep doing that all night. He renamed the place Nauvoo, from a Hebrew word he'd been studying, meaning beautiful or pleasant. And then a swamp full of sick refugees did something genuinely hard to believe. They drained it, laid out a grid, and built a city. And the fuel came from across an ocean. Remember from part 3 that Joseph sent Heber Kimball to England in the middle of the Kirtland collapse. Well, by 1840, most of the quorum of the 12 was over there working the mill towns of Lancashire and the Midlands, and they were baptizing factory workers by the thousand and putting them on ships. Somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 British converts crossed the Atlantic to Nauvoo in that decade. Imagine that from a Liverpool spinner's point of view. You are working 14-hour days in a cotton mill, and two Americans knock on your door and tell you there is a prophet and a city and a river. By 1844, Nauvoo had somewhere around 12,000 people in it, which put it in the same conversation as Chicago. A destitute refugee camp had become one of the largest cities in the state in 5 years. That's the fact people forget when they think of this period as a slow decline. Nauvoo was a boom town, and it was booming right up until the week it ended. And then the state of Illinois handed that boomtown something no other city in America had. Not a bigger one, a different one. On the 16th of December, 1840, the Illinois legislature passed the Nauvoo Charter, and Governor Thomas Carlin signed it. And here's the political reality underneath that, because it explains everything that happens later. Illinois was closely divided between Whigs and Democrats, and 12,000 people who tended to vote as a bloc were, to both parties, the most valuable thing in the state. Both parties courted them. So the charter sailed through, and almost nobody read it carefully. What it gave was extraordinary. A city council empowered to pass any ordinance it liked, so long as it wasn't repugnant to the Constitution of the state or the United States, which is a phrase you could drive a wagon through. A municipal court with the power to issue writs of habeas corpus, meaning the city could order the release of a person held under arrest. A university, chartered inside the city. And a militia, the Nauvoo Legion, an independent city militia that grew to somewhere between 2,000 and 3,000 men, and by some counts higher, with its own arms and its own officers. Joseph Smith was its commanding officer, with the rank of lieutenant general, which was not a small thing to call yourself. No serving officer in the United States Army held that rank at the time. The last man to hold it had been George Washington. Now put yourself on a farm outside Warsaw, 20 miles downriver. A religious group that got run out of Missouri under a shooting war has just built a city in your county, faster than anything you've seen. It votes as one unit and can decide any statewide election. It has its own army, drilling in uniform, larger than most of the regular army units on the frontier. And it has a court that can spring its own leaders out of custody. You do not have to hate anybody's religion to find that arrangement alarming. You just have to be able to count. And this is the honest part, faithful telling's underplay. The neighbor's fear in Illinois was not the pure bigotry the Missouri story sometimes was. It had an arithmetic underneath it, and while the city rose, the doctrine came in a flood. More in these 5 years than in the 9 before them. In August of 1840, at the funeral of a man named Seymour Brunson, Joseph announced that the living could be baptized on behalf of the dead, and within weeks, people were wading into the Mississippi and being baptized for grandparents who'd never heard any of this. Think about what that does to a community of people who'd left families behind in England and in New England, some of whom had cut them off. It made the dead reachable. On the 6th of April, 1841, they laid the cornerstones of a temple on the bluff above the city, and again a poor people started building an expensive building. On the 17th of March, 1842, in the upper room of Joseph's store on Water Street, the Relief Society was organized with about 20 women and Emma Smith as its president. And we'll be spending a whole episode on what those women went on to do. On the 4th of May, 1842, in that same upstairs room, Joseph introduced the temple ceremony that Latter-day Saints call the endowment, a ceremony of instruction and covenant-making that members hold sacred and don't discuss in detail outside the temple. And I'll respect that line tonight the way the church itself does. And on the 7th of April, 1844, at a funeral for a man named King Follett, he preached the sermon that pushed furthest of all, teaching that God was once a man and that men and women may become like God. That's the Nauvoo people don't picture. Not a city under siege. A city where the ideas were arriving faster than anybody could absorb them, and where, for a few years, a spinner from Lancashire could stand in a field on the Mississippi and be told that his dead mother was not out of reach, and that he himself was the child of a God who had once been where he was standing. And now I have to introduce you to the man almost nobody tells you about, because without him, the next part of tonight doesn't make sense. His name was John Cook Bennett. Bennett showed up in Nauvoo in 1840 out of nowhere, and he was, on paper, the most useful man who ever walked into that city. He was a physician. He was quartermaster general of the state of Illinois, which gave him real standing in Springfield, and he used it. Bennett is the man who lobbied that extraordinary charter through the legislature. Within months, he was elected the first mayor of Nauvoo, made a major general of the Legion, and installed as an assistant president of the church, standing beside Joseph Smith at the top of it. That is one of the fastest ascents in the history of this faith, and it took him about a year. He was also, it turned out, a fraud with a trail behind him. He had a wife and children in Ohio he'd never mentioned, and in Nauvoo he was seducing women, and the way he did it is the part that poisons everything downstream. He told them there was a secret doctrine, that the leaders lived it, that Joseph approved, and that it was called spiritual wifery, which was a lie built on the shape of a truth, and that is the single most dangerous kind. Something secret really was going on among the leadership. Bennett found the outline of it and sold a counterfeit version door to door. It came apart in the spring of 1842. Bennett resigned as mayor on the 17th of May and was cut off from the church, and 2 days later Joseph Smith took the mayor's office himself, which is how a prophet ended up running a city government. And Bennett went to war. He published a run of letters in a Springfield newspaper that summer, then a whole book, The History of the Saints, an expose of Joe Smith and Mormonism, and took it on the lecture circuit. It was the first best-selling expose written against the saints, and it did what a mixture always does. It printed things that were true, things that were exaggerated, and things that were invented, in one voice, and so that afterward nobody outside Nauvoo could tell them apart. And one of his charges landed on a name you already know. On the 6th of May, 1842, in Independence, Missouri, a man fired a pistol through a window and put 4 balls into the head and neck of Lowburn Boggs, the former governor who had signed the extermination order we spent Part 3 on. Boggs, astonishingly, survived. Bennett went into print claiming Joseph Smith had ordered it, and that Joseph's bodyguard, Porter Rockwell, had pulled the trigger. Rockwell was eventually arrested, held for months, and released without conviction. Nothing was ever proved. But sit with the position that put Joseph Smith in. The governor who tried to have his people exterminated gets shot, and the accusation lands on him. And the man making it is his own former counselor with a book to sell. That's the atmosphere the next part of tonight happens in. Whatever you conclude about plural marriage, understand that by 1842 the subject was already loose in the world in Bennett's corrupted version, aimed at the church like a weapon, which made telling the truth about the real thing look exactly like confirming the lie. So let's do the real one properly. This is the chapter this church spent 150 years wishing it could explain more easily. Plural marriage. And I want to start by telling you where my facts come from, because on this subject, that matters more than anywhere else. In 2014, the church published an essay on its own website called Plural Marriage in Kirtland and Nauvoo. It is not an apologist's blog post. It's the institution's own account, with footnotes, and almost everything I'm about to say is either in it or in the Joseph Smith papers. If you take one thing from tonight, take that. You do not have to go to a critic to learn this. It's on the church's own website, and it has been for years. Here's what the record shows. Sometime in the mid-1830s, in Kirtland, Joseph Smith married a young woman named Fanny Alger, and it went badly enough that Oliver Cowdery called it a dirty affair, and it contributed to Oliver's break with him. In April of 1841, in Nauvoo, he was sealed to Louisa Beeman, and that's usually counted as the first plural marriage of the Nauvoo period. Over the next 3 years, there were more. The church's own essay says, careful estimates put the number of women sealed to Joseph Smith between 30 and 40. Some of those sealings were, by the essay's own account, to women who were already married to living husbands, roughly a dozen of them, and the essay states that plainly and then says that the reasons are not fully known, which is the church conceding it does not have an explanation. And in the spring of 1843, he was sealed to Helen Mar Kimball, the daughter of his friend Heber Kimball, several months before her 15th birthday, and that's in the essay too. Historians generally think that particular sealing was for eternity rather than a marriage in the ordinary sense, and Helen herself later wrote about it and defended the principle her whole life, and also wrote about what it cost her. Then, on the 12th of July, 1843, in the office of his store, he dictated a revelation on eternal and plural marriage to his clerk, William Clayton. That's section 132, and it is still in the church's scripture today. And here is the fact that does the most damage, and I'm going to say it in the plainest words I've got. While all of this was happening, the church publicly denied that it was happening. Leaders stood up and said the church practiced one marriage between one man and one woman. And the printed statement on marriage in the church's own book of Scripture said the same. And behind it, a growing circle of leaders were being sealed to plural wives under an oath of secrecy. That's not a critic's characterization. That's the timeline. So let me build the strongest case against him, the real one, not the cartoon. It sounds like this. Here is a man holding total religious authority over a community that had followed him 1,000 miles and buried its dead along the way. He approached women inside that community, including a girl of 14 and including other men's wives, and told them the command came from God. He asked them for secrecy. He built a doctrine in which refusing carried eternal consequence, and he denied the whole thing in public while doing it. Strip the theology out of that paragraph, and you are describing a pattern of coercion. And any of us would recognize it instantly if the name at the top were anybody else's. That is the case. It is not made only by enemies of this church. It is made by people who love it and cannot get past that page. Now here's what an honest answer looks like, and it is not a bow on top. 3 things. First, what the record actually supports and what it doesn't. Historians disagree, genuinely and out loud, about how many of these sealings involved a sexual relationship, particularly the ones to women with living husbands. And anyone who tells you that question is settled in either direction is selling you something. The women themselves are the strongest witnesses available, and they were not silent. In 1892, in a Missouri courtroom, in litigation over the temple lot in Independence, several of Joseph Smith's plural widows testified under oath about their marriages as elderly women, decades later, with nothing left to gain. Those depositions exist, and you can read them. They are, for my money, the most important primary source in this entire subject, and they are also not simple. Second, the secrecy has a context, and context is not an excuse, but it is a fact. Everything about this was illegal, socially catastrophic, and lethal in 1843 America. Disclosure meant mobs, and they had already been through Missouri. That explains the concealment. It does not explain the public denials, which were affirmative statements, not silence, and I'm not going to pretend it does. Third, and this is where I have to stop short of the tidy ending, I do not have a resolution for you tonight that makes this comfortable. Believers hold that this was commanded, and they point to Abraham, to Jacob, to the men in Genesis this revelation explicitly appeals to, and to the fact that the women who lived it defended it for the rest of their lives. Critics hold that a man with that much authority used revelation to get what he wanted. Both of those readings are available from the same documents. What I can tell you is that pretending the documents say something gentler is the one option that is definitely wrong. And it's the option this church tried for about a century. And there's one more person in this room, and she is the one I think about most. Emma Smith. The same Emma who had crossed the ice out of Missouri with her children and her husband's papers sewn into her skirts, who was elected president of the Relief Society in that upper room in 1842, and who by every account had earned an opinion. She was told, and her response across those last 2 years was not one thing. It swung. There were stretches where she consented, and stretches where she fought it as hard as a person can fight anything. When the revelation was written down on the 12th of July, 1843, Hyrum Smith offered to take it to her and read it to her himself, apparently believing that a written revelation in his hand would settle it. It did not. Hyrum came back and reported he had never been spoken to that way in his life. William Clayton, who wrote the thing down, recorded afterward that Emma got hold of the manuscript and burned it. And the only reason the text survives is that a clerk named Joseph Kingsbury had already made a copy. And then the hardest part, which is not about 1843 at all. Emma outlived him by 35 years. She never went west. She raised their sons in Illinois, and for the rest of her life she told those sons that their father had not practiced plural marriage. In 1879, months before she died, she gave an interview to her son that got published as her last testimony, and she denied it flatly. Historians have argued about that interview ever since, and the arguments run from denial to protection to a mother deciding what her boys would have to carry. I'm not going to tell you which one it was. I'm going to tell you that she is the person in this story with the fewest defenders on either side, that she was there for all of it, and that she gets a full episode on this channel of her own. Because a woman who has been used as a footnote by both camps for 150 years has earned better than a paragraph in somebody else's story. Which brings us to power, and to the part where the arithmetic in Hancock County starts to look like a fuse. By the spring of 1844, count the offices in one man's hands. Joseph Smith was president of the church. He was mayor of Nauvoo, having taken the office in May of 1842. He was lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion. He was a trustee of the church's property. He sat on the municipal court that could free him from arrest, and it did, repeatedly, when Missouri kept trying to extradite him for the 1838 war. And on the 29th of January, 1844, he announced that he was running for President of the United States. That was not a stunt, exactly. He'd written to every declared candidate asking what they'd do for the saints who'd been robbed in Missouri. And the answers ranged from nothing to Henry Clay telling him his people should go to Oregon. So he ran himself, on a platform that included abolishing slavery by 1850 by buying the slaves' freedom with money from public land sales, and reforming the prisons, which for 1844 is a startling document. And then, in March of 1844, he organized a body called the Council of 50, meant to be the political arm of the Kingdom of God, and in one of its meetings he was anointed king, priest, and ruler over Israel on the earth. Now, for 170 years, that fact circulated mostly as a rumor and an accusation. Then, in 2016, the church published the Council of 50's actual minutes as a volume of the Joseph Smith papers, and anyone can read them. What they show is a body that spent most of its time debating where to move, Texas, Oregon, California, and a ceremony that its members understood in a religious and future sense, rather than as a claim on the state of Illinois. What they also show is a religious leader accepting the title king in a country that had fought a war to be rid of them. Both of those are in the same minute book. So the neighbor's fuse was lit and burning. In Warsaw, an editor named Thomas Sharp had been running the Warsaw Signal since 1841 as effectively a weekly campaign against the saints, printing the Charter, the Legion, and the block vote in front of his readers week after week. a political party organized in Hancock County on a single plank, opposition to the Saints. And the men most dangerous to Joseph Smith by the spring of 1844 were not in Missouri or in Warsaw. They were inside Nauvoo, and some of them had been at the top of his own church, which is how you get a printing press on Mulholland Street. William Law was Joseph Smith's second counselor in the First Presidency, which is the second highest body in the church. He was a successful businessman, by all accounts a decent man, and he had been told about plural marriage and had rejected it flatly. In April of 1844, he was excommunicated, and he did not go quietly. Along with his brother Wilson, the Foster brothers, the Higbee brothers, and a man named Charles Ivans, he set up a newspaper, and on the 7th of June, 1844, they published one issue of the Nauvoo Expositor. And here's what it said, and here's the part that makes this hard. It accused Joseph Smith of practicing and teaching plural marriage. True. It accused him of teaching a plurality of gods, which he had done in public 2 months earlier at King Follett's funeral in front of thousands of people. True. It accused him of mixing church and political power in a way that endangered the Republic. Arguable, and not crazy. And then it called for the repeal of the Nauvoo Charter, which would have stripped the city of its court, its militia, and its self-government at a stroke. That last line is the one that mattered. The Expositor was not just embarrassing. It was aimed at the one legal shield keeping Missouri's extradition warrants off Joseph Smith's neck. The City Council met on the 8th of June and again on the 10th and debated it for something like 7 hours across the 2 days. They pulled Blackstone off the shelf, the standard legal authority of the era, and read the section on the abatement of nuisances, which was a real doctrine that let a public body remove a public nuisance without waiting for a trial. They argued that a libelous paper aimed at inciting a mob against a city that had already been mobbed once was exactly that. And they voted. Joseph Smith, as mayor, ordered the city marshal, John Green, to abate it. Green took men from the Legion to Mulholland Street that afternoon and destroyed the press. So let's argue that decision properly, both directions, because it's the hinge the whole rest of this saga swings on. The case against is short, and it is brutal. An elected official destroyed a newspaper that had criticized him personally, using a militia he commanded under an order he signed as mayor, and after a vote by a council he dominated. If you set out to write a textbook example of the thing a free press exists to prevent, you would write that sentence. And the fact that the paper was telling the truth about him makes it worse, not better. Now the defense, and it has real pieces. The First Amendment in 1844 did not restrain city governments. It restrained Congress. Free speech and free press were not applied against the states until the 20th century, through the 14th Amendment, in a Supreme Court case in 1925. Illinois had its own free press protection in its state constitution, but nuisance abatement was live common law, and the council really did have Blackstone in front of them, and their fear was not hypothetical. These people had been driven out of Missouri 5 years earlier by a mob that started with a newspaper campaign. The most careful legal study of this ever done was published in 1965 in the Utah Law Review by Dallin Oaks, then a young law professor at the University of Chicago, and later a Utah Supreme Court justice. And his conclusions are worth having exactly, because faithful and critical accounts both tend to quote half of him. Oaks found that the council had no right to abate the paper on the basis of its political and religious allegations. None. On the charges of libel and immorality, he found the city could have made a defensible case, with support from Illinois precedent and from Blackstone. But he also found that the doctrine allowed the suppression of the offending publication, not the destruction of the press itself, and that smashing the machine went beyond anything the law of nuisance supported. So the honest verdict is a layered one, partly arguable in 1844 legal terms, indefensible as principle, and catastrophic as strategy, which is the part that gets lost. One issue of a small paper with a few hundred readers, left alone, would have been forgotten inside a year. Destroyed, it became the single most useful thing Joseph Smith's enemies ever received. Thomas Sharp had the story in the Warsaw Signal within days, calling for citizens to rise. Within 17 days, Joseph Smith was dead. Which leaves the question I said I'd answer at the start. What has skipping this cost? Because that's the villain tonight, and it isn't the mob, and it isn't William Law. For most of the 20th century, the way this period got taught in this church was by leaving things out. Not by lying, mostly, by simplification, and by trusting that a member would never bump into the rest of it. Nauvoo was a beautiful city and a temple. The Expositor was a scurrilous paper. Plural marriage was practiced in Utah under Brigham Young, and the Nauvoo part got a sentence, or none. And then the internet arrived, and a generation of members met all of it at once, at 2 a.m, from somebody who hated their church, and the shock was never really about the fact. Talk to people who left over this, and you will hear the same sentence over and over. It wasn't that it happened, it was that nobody told me. A person can carry a hard fact. What breaks trust is discovering that the people who taught you knew, and chose the comfortable version because the implication is that they thought you couldn't handle it, and nobody forgives being handled. To its credit, this church changed course. Between 2013 and 2015, it published a series of essays on exactly these subjects, plural marriage and Nauvoo among them, footnoted and honest, and then put the Joseph Smith papers online for anyone with a browser, including the Council of 50 Minutes that had been closed for a century and a half. I'd argue that was one of the most consequential decisions the institution made in my lifetime, and it happened quietly, without a single billboard. So when somebody tells you the church hides its history, the accurate answer in 2026 is that it publishes it in full, for free, and that the harder question is why so few members have read it. That's the whole reason this channel exists, and it's why I won't skip a page for you. A faith that can only survive being told carefully isn't one I'd want, and I don't think it's the one I've got. So mark where this leaves him, because Part 5 is 17 days long. On the 18th of June, 1844, Joseph Smith declared martial law in Nauvoo and called out the Legion, which is the act that would get him charged, not with destroying a press, but with treason against the state of Illinois. Governor Thomas Ford came down to Carthage and told him to stand trial there, and gave him his personal pledge of protection. Joseph crossed the Mississippi to run, and then turned around and came back, and there's a line attributed to him from that morning that if his life was of no value to his friends, it was of none to himself. He rode into Carthage on the 24th of June with his brother Hiram, and 3 days later, on the 27th, a mob with blackened faces came up the stairs of the Carthage jail. Here's the detail that almost never makes the Sunday version, and it tells you how frightened those men in that room were. Joseph Smith did not die praying. A friend had smuggled him a small pistol 2 days earlier, and he fired it into the stairwell before he went out the window. That, and who was tried for it, and what happened to a church that suddenly had no prophet, is Part 5. One question for you before you go, and I do read these. Which hard chapter of this history did you have to sit with the longest before you made your peace with it, and what actually helped? Not the tidy answer, the real one. Because somebody scrolling past your comment tonight is sitting with the same page at 2 a.m, and yours might be the thing that gets read. I'm Nathan Reeves. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.